And welcome back to our panel discussion, Moving to the Cloud, What's the Best Approach for Me? Sponsored by NetApp and BlueRiver IT, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our guests today are Mary Jean Schmidt, Federal Business Development Manager at NetApp, David McLaughlin, CEO and owner of BlueRiver IT, Harry Lee, the Senior Computer Scientist for Infrastructure at the Census Bureau, and Sandra Kuntz, Director of Production Operations and Infrastructure in the Office of the CIO at the Peace Corps. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And before the break, we were talking about management of these mixed and hybrid infrastructures, and we heard from Harry how the Census Bureau uses enterprise architecture approach. Sandra, how does the Peace Corps handle the fact that you have infrastructure in so many formats?
Mm-hmm. We similarly have an enterprise architecture with a roadmap that guides us looking 5 years out as we work with each of our business customers to figure out what applications they either have that are aging and need attention, or processes that need some work around the area of applications. So we have a very effective process for working with business owners, as I mentioned earlier, very early in their decision-making process, so we can ensure that our roadmap is all-inclusive to the extent that we can know, the future, and also that we plan around the infrastructure needs, whether they be internal on-premise or cloud solutions that we're looking for from the very beginning. So, the planning around the early startup is very critical to us. Then, as applications are, going under development, we have a life cycle that we follow, which again also has checkpoints throughout the way to make sure that the application is on track and that the development, should it be going with the cloud, with a hosted solution, that we have, all of the things that we need to be thinking about checked off. Then, once we're into having applications and infrastructure that we're managing, what's really important to us and what we've been focused on over the last several years is standardizing our environment to really streamline what we're supporting. And then we're also baselining. So we're looking at our applications to see, what's required, what do they require to operate as effectively as possible. And then from a customer standpoint, what's acceptable? What's an acceptable level of service? Because that's critical for no matter whether we're doing an in-house development or upgrade or we're sending something out to the cloud, what's going to be an acceptable level of service. Mm-hmm. So that's a big key area for us.
And you mentioned the business owners. Mm-hmm. Is it important for, say, the person, to go back to the application we spoke about earlier, the volunteer onboarding, mm-hmm. for example, whoever is in charge of that, right. Is it important for that person to know where their application is, how it's being handled technologically? Does it matter to them?
It doesn't necessarily matter to them where it's being hosted or what infrastructure is supporting it necessarily, but what they're going to be very interested, of course, in is if it's not responsive when they need it, if it's not available. So all of those kind of service level agreement things are what we focus on with them, just making sure up front that everyone's expectations are level set.
Mary Jean, it seems like all of this would cause a new approach that requires some maybe cultural or thinking change for CIOs and data center managers, systems administrators that now have a wholly different looking environment than they might have been used to for the past 10 years. Or even those that go back to the client-server days, it's really different from that.
Right, and a couple of thoughts. I heard Terry Halverson, the Navy CIO, speak last week that that's in fact one of the attributes that he's looking at to determine the blend of cloud services. So, for example, it's not just about security, which is obviously important. It's not just about data, which we talked about earlier, but also the social environment and how the end users expect to receive, the information that they're trying to get or access to the applications. But another thought I might kind of venture into that's along those lines is that, as Sandra and Harry both said, they're no longer going to be these operators of, big data centers. They're going to be these brokers of services. So the next thing on the horizon is this whole idea of a cloud broker. And will agencies become their own cloud broker, and or will they use one that's provided, for example, through a GSA service. So we're seeing this, new frontier of single panes of management, if you will, across cloud service providers. It's another whole new area for agencies to consider.
Yeah, because you have your old standard SMTP applications to manage the network that you own through the Ethernet and so on across the the internetworks, and all that has to somehow be inculcated into the cloud or the cloud into it. Correct?
Right. I mean, I think the nirvana for an agency, if I might use that term, is to be able to manage both the on-premise, kind of the legacy hardware-based applications that they have to keep on those environments because they're maybe written in a language that doesn't port so well to a new environment, and also they're maybe hyperscaler-based apps, et cetera, across, the environment with one management interface or one view from the CIO level.
Sure. David, do you ever see that? Say you build a cloud out for someone and they walk in and it looks like nothing they've ever seen before and they wonder how they're going to manage it all?
Well, I think there's a perception that it is going to be much different than what they're used to. But if you're looking at a pure infrastructure side, what you deploy in the cloud it's still compute resources, it's still networking, it's still virtualization, there's some automation built in. All those things are still there. It's just someplace else. So then you have to explain, this is how you actually access that. This is how you deploy your application. So it's not such a big shift when they actually start to understand how it works. What's surprising to me is when we started this process, over the last 4 years, is how many people you go into, they run data centers and they say, please take my data center, take my stuff. I want to focus on my applications, my mission objectives. I want to do that. That's where I want to spend my money. I don't want to have to pull equipment in and rack it and stack it and track my service level agreements with the so forth and so on. So a lot of people are understanding now that, hey, let's take care of the infrastructure first, and then we can address the applications, how we handle it. Another interesting thing is when people say, we want you to do this as a service. Maybe it's patch management. Maybe it's something that they do already. And they're saying, well, I have staff that can now do my infrastructure, but if I go to a cloud, I don't have anybody to do that. You need to help me with that. So if you look at the broker model that people are saying, well, broker would say to me that you're taking different components of a cloud, putting them together and giving it to somebody, but what people really want is those components, but they want somebody to actually manage it for them too and provide that as a service. So we're seeing quite a bit of that as well.
And Harry, you mentioned earlier that the broker, that Census might be its own cloud broker, the IT department. What's involved with brokering, and how do you make sure that SLAs get translated, service level agreements get translated through the broker layer to the actual cloud infrastructure provider?
Well, everything that we need to do as an IT service provider or a broker needs to really be based on the defined needs of the business, and that needs is performance, its availability, scalability, and so forth. So really, it's also managing that customer relationship. So one of the things we've done in all decisions that the CIO makes, he has his counterparts from all the other 8 other directorates involved in these decisions. So it's about the service. When you look at we can control what we have on premise, but once you go to an external provider, you need to make sure that whatever contractual relationships you have in place, those expectations of the customers translate back into that agreement or contract with the provider. We talked earlier about that. There's a lot of things to think about. And so a cloud service broker might make sense even for the IT department as a broker, as an intermediary to a lot of different providers that are out there.
So if the business unit or business owner doesn't see the cloud itself, at least they can go to somebody inside Census that does see it and say, Harry, what's going on here?
Right. The service should be transparent. Our service provider should be transparent to that end user. And we just manage that relationship and the expectations of SLAs, translating them to anybody else we might be working with providing those services.
And Sandra, what do you seek in SLAs? What is it that makes a good provider for you, and does it vary according to application and so on?
I think it will vary according to application and what the customers of that particular application need, whether it's a global application. Some of our things are not. They're just, one line of business. Peace Corps is also looking at the idea of the cloud broker role and looking at it from, startup, basically. We're looking at internalizing that role within the CIO and having that be the expert who would be the bridge between the cloud services. We're starting that up, and then our internal customers, as you had mentioned. We think that's a vital role that right today we don't have, but we're seeking that.
So also internal brokering.
Exactly, yeah.
And so how do they get their information? I mean, what are they, that's a new task for the CIO. You're confident that they can acquire the skills? It sounds like a very specialized kind of art to be able to pick a cloud.
Well, I think the specialized art of it may be in what we're thinking is we need someone who has the expertise in what's available and what exactly to look for and all the kind of gotchas that we need to plan ahead for, but also be able to be inside our enterprise so that they can know our business and really be that bridge. And it may not be one resource; it might be a team with some expertise that we're bringing in with knowledge of the cloud environment.
And so that means if, say, you do move email to the cloud at some point, and suppose you choose one of the well-known providers of email that are in the cloud, probably you don't really need to go see what they have. Whereas if you're moving critical data, say about volunteers, about distinct programs that are unique to Peace Corps, then you might want to have a little bit closer touch to that.
Right. I mean, today we work closely with the business owner to, see if their process needs any sort of re-engineering. We want it to be as streamlined as possible. But then once we have that, it might touch many parts of our organization globally, and just having a team or a resource that can help us figure out the best placement of the data and the application.
And so who's involved in all these decisions? I mean, who do you pull together for that?
Well, similar to what Harry said, I mean, our CIO works within a team of her peers, and she has established very good processes for gathering early in the budget planning process so that we are aware of what other parts of the agency are looking at in terms of their priorities, and it's all aligned, of course, to the agency strategic plan, et cetera. But coming down to the actual planning of things for the out years, our CIO works closely with her peers, and they reach agreements and sign off on plans.
Mary Jean, what do you see as best practices across industries for establishing base level requirements, service level agreements, and also for choosing who's the best cloud provider for a particular situation?
Right. So number one, I think agencies have a lot of choice and growing numbers of choices of cloud providers, be it for software as a service, down to infrastructure as a service. But a couple of thoughts. I think one best practice that is starting to emerge and become more prevalent is that agencies are now releasing, drafts for information, et cetera, for market research that are more based on service levels and what the mission needs for that environment versus kind of the functional requirements that were of, several years ago versus, spelling out what type of, compute, what type of storage, what type of network they needed. And now it's more about, I need this level of availability, I need this type of access, I need, et cetera. So I think that's coming. It's not 100% shifted, but I think that's going to take some time just because we still see a lot of more on-premise kind of functional environments. But even there, we're seeing agencies kind of move to more of converged infrastructures, even for their kind of in-house environments, because it takes away the part of the environment that they don't need to do anymore because it's not germane to their mission, like cabling and racking and stacking, that type of thing.
So a converged environment is separate from a consolidated, or a separate meaning from a consolidated environment.
Right.
In how?
Well, a converged environment that perhaps knits together some of the components that in the past agencies themselves or their workforce has kind of knit together themselves. For example, you have storage, compute, and network that you need in a stack to run applications. So in the past, there might have been a procurement for one of those pieces or all of those pieces together, and now they can buy them kind of, procure them kind of knit together in a, let's just use the term kind of cloud in a box or infrastructure in a box, if you will. And so that type of design and testing and qualification doesn't have to be done for an on-premise environment.
And David, I wanted to ask you in that respect, we hear more and more about virtualization moving from the server and then the desktop, and now to the network and to storage. Do you see that really coming on in a big way, and how does that affect cloud construction and cloud services?
Well, it does, and it already is, in my opinion, there. If you look at a lot of the big cloud providers now, a lot of that is already virtualized. You can go online and swipe a credit card and deploy a network with applications running and storage all provisioned in a matter of minutes now. So a lot of that has been done, both at the private side and then in the community side. So again, the infrastructure has moved pretty far along now where people are able to do that. I think what's interesting is on the application side, what the automation in the infrastructure is going to allow people to do now is if Census develops a PCI compliant solution that's web-enabled on a mobile device, now, because of the ability to redeploy it over and over again in an easy fashion, they then become the broker to another group within the federal government. They may need the same service. So that collaboration is pretty exciting to me, to see how each agency can leverage each other's skill sets and hard work. So that's coming down the road, too.
All right, on that note, that brings our discussion to a close. I want to thank today's guests. Harry Lee, Senior Computer Scientist for Infrastructure at the Census Bureau; David McLaughlin, CEO and owner of BlueRiver IT; Mary Jean Schmidt, Federal Business Development Manager at NetApp; and Sandra Kuntz, Director of Production Operations and Infrastructure in the Office of the CIO at the Peace Corps. I'm Tom Temin, Federal News Radio, 1500 AM.
On behalf of BlueRiver IT and NetApp, thank you for joining us for this informative discussion. You'll be presented with some polling questions as you leave the webinar to help us improve the future sessions. We appreciate your feedback. We'll have the archive from this session available shortly, and a link will be sent to you for you to share with your colleagues. Those of you who requested a training certificate for this webinar should receive it in the next 2 weeks. Be sure to register for upcoming webinars from WTOP, Federal News Radio, and Fed Insider. Look for upcoming sessions at www.fedinsider.com/events. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.